It was a bleak morning in late October, the sort of morning that reminded one how gray and grim London could be at the turn of the season. A thick fog had curled its ghostly tendrils around the chimneys of Baker Street and pressed itself insistently against our window panes like a thief attempting entry. The gas lamps flickered against the gloom, casting yellow halos that shimmered in the wet air. It was on just such a morning that I found myself once again at the hearth of our rooms at 221B, watching Sherlock Holmes read the day's edition of the Times with a mixture of disinterest and disdain. Chapter 01. He sat, as he often did on such days, in his deep leather armchair, clad in a tattered dressing gown of indeterminate color, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his sharp gray eyes darting over the pages like a falcon hunting prey. The fireplace sputtered with reluctant warmth, and the scent of burnt coal mingled with that faint trace of chemical residue which seemed to cling to Holmes as permanently as his shadow. I had just finished my breakfast eggs, toast, and a lukewarm cup of tea when he spoke without lifting his gaze. "I see Inspector Lestrade has bungled another," Holmes murmured, tapping the folded corner of the paper. I glanced up from buttering a second piece of toast. "Oh, which case this time?" "It's the murder at Belgravia Crescent," he said, folding the paper and tossing it aside with the air of a man discarding a dull puzzle box. I had skimmed the article earlier. I'm on it, lacking in detail. There was very little to go on, as I recall. A body discovered in a locked drawing room. No forced entry. No theft. No signs of struggle. Which, of course, are the very signs we must take most seriously, Holmes said with a ghost of a smile. I shook my head. Still, the article states the doors were locked from within and all windows secured. Unless the victim managed to kill himself with a blunt object to the back of the skull and then hide the weapon, it would seem rather impossible. Holmes gave a soft chuckle. "You do your imagination a disservice, Watson. Murder is never truly impossible, only improbable. And improbabilities, you'll recall, are where the game becomes interesting." At that moment, the sharp click of footsteps echoed in the stairwell below, followed by a hesitant rap at the door. Mrs. Hudson, ever the gatekeeper to our peculiar domain, opened the door slightly and peered in. "There's a lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. She wouldn't give a name, but she insists it's urgent. She's ... Well, you had better see for yourself." Holmes rose slowly, his expression sharpening into keen interest. "Show her in, Mrs. Hudson, and please, some fresh tea." Watson's appears to have surrendered to despair. The door opened fully, and into our sitting room stepped one of the most curious figures I had yet seen in all my years accompanying Holmes. She was perhaps 35, striking without being beautiful, her bearing both proud and fragile. Her coat was of navy blue wool, finely tailored, though it bore signs of hurried travel, a small tear at the hem and a spatter of dried mud along the bottom edge. Her gloved hands were clenched tightly round a velvet reticule, but what caught our attention most was her eyes wide, haunted, and red-rimmed as though she had not slept in days. Holmes inclined his head. "Good morning, madame. Do come in. Take a seat by the fire. The fog this morning is quite insidious." She nodded stiffly and moved toward the chair I offered her beside the hearth. She took it without removing her gloves or hat, which bore a faded ribbon pinned to one side. "You must forgive my intrusion, Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice low and urgent, "but I had nowhere else to go. The police would do nothing, and I fear something dreadful has happened, or is about to." "We are quite accustomed to dreadful things, madam," Holmes said, pouring himself a cup of tea and motioning toward her with a gesture of polite curiosity. "Now, begin at the beginning. Who are you, and what brings you to Baker Street at this hour?" "My name is Mrs. Clara Pendlebury," she said. "I am more rather I was the companion to Lady Charlotte Willoughby of Grosvenor Square. Watson and I exchanged a glance. The Willoughby name was not unfamiliar in the circles of the elite. Wealthy, reclusive, entangled in more than one whispered scandal. The family rarely sought the public eye. Holmes raised an eyebrow. The reclusive dowager, widow of the shipping magnate. The same, Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. She has vanished, Mr. Holmes. 3 nights ago, she retired to her rooms at 10 o'clock. Her maid brought her tea. All was as usual, but the next morning, she was gone. Gone, Holmes echoed, leaning forward. Is vanished from a locked room. Clara nodded. The doors were bolted from within, the windows likewise. No one could have entered door left without being seen, yet she is nowhere to be found. Watson scribbled a note in his journal. Hey, there were no signs of violence. No note, no disturbance. None, Clara said. Her jewelry and valuables were untouched, her bed unslept in. It is as though she dissolved into the air. Holmes steepled his fingers again, and the police. They concluded she wandered off in the night, that perhaps senility had taken her, but I know her better than they ever could. She was lucid sharp, even despite her age. She did not leave of her own accord. Holmes stood and walked to the window, pulling aside the curtain and peering into the swirling fog. You are correct, Mrs. Pendlebury, in your belief that the impossible often masks the merely improbable, and the improbable, in turn, is often a veil for something altogether human. He turned and looked directly at her. Tell me what of her family? Enemies? House staff? Was there anyone with cause to wish her gone? Clara hesitated. There is her nephew, Mr. Reginald Willoughby. He came to stay a fortnight ago, ostensibly to attend to business interests. But he and Lady Charlotte argued often and bitterly. Holmes's eyes glittered. About what? Her will, Clara said. Simply, she was rewriting it. Holmes's smile was faint, but unmistakable. Of course she was. There was a long silence as Holmes drifted into one of his pensive moods, his gaze seeming to study something far beyond the room, beyond even the city. Finally, he said, You have done well to come, Mrs. Pendlebury. I believe we shall take a small walk to Grosvenor Square this afternoon. Watson, bring your coat, and perhaps a Kainu may need to poke at the shadows. Do you believe she is alive? I asked as I retrieved my overcoat. Holmes gave no answer. Instead, he lit a cigarette and exhaled a stream of smoke that curled like a question mark into the air. Let us just say, he murmured, the game has begun. The journey to Grosvenor Square was one I had made only a handful of times during my years in London, and always with a certain self-awareness. The district was the very heart of London's old money, the architecture imposing, the sidewalks immaculate, and the iron railings painted with a sort of gloss that suggested not just wealth, but deliberate, measured control. As Holmes and I stepped out into the fog-veiled streets that afternoon, following Mrs. Pendlebury in her modest blue coat, I could not help but feel the heavy curtain of secrecy that so often drapes itself over privilege and inheritance. Holmes said little on the way. He moved with his usual energy, his long stride cutting efficiently through the mist. But I knew his mind was far from the paving stones of Mayfair. His gaze flicked from house to carriage to lamppost, never still, drinking in the texture of the city, as if every brick and boot print was a sentence in a book only he could read. Notice the footprints, Watson, he said suddenly, as we crossed Berkeley Street. I looked down. Too many to make sense of. Exactly, Holmes replied. And yet, the absence of a single detail often tells us far more than its presence. I had no time to press him further, for Mrs. Pendlebury had turned through a wrought iron gate and mounted the steps of No. 14 Grosvenor Square, tall, pale stone house with dark green shutters and the subdued grandeur typical of its station. The door was opened at once by a silent, silver-haired butler who gave Holmes a long, measuring glance before standing aside to let us in. "This way," Clara whispered, leading us past a grand foyer and up the curved staircase. The carpet so thick, our steps were swallowed in silence. The air grew colder as we climbed, as though the house itself were reluctant to admit us to its upper levels. She paused before a mahogany door on the second floor. "This is Lady Charlotte's bedchamber. It has not been touched since the morning we found it empty." Holmes studied the doorknob without touching it. "Who discovered her absence?" "Her maid, Rose," Clara replied. "She came in to wake her at 8 o'clock, as usual. Anyone else entered the room since then?" "Only Inspector Fowler from the yard. And Reginald, though I suspect more out of show than concern." Holmes gave a single nod, then reached into his coat and drew out a pair of delicate gloves which he fitted onto his hands with practiced care. He opened the door. The room beyond was as elegant as one might expect from a woman of Lady Charlotte's station, yet eerily untouched. Heavy velvet curtains remained drawn, allowing only the palest sliver of light to filter through. A grand four-poster bed stood at the center, perfectly made. A mahogany writing desk sat near the window, with an ivory-handled pen laid neatly atop it. A dressing screen occupied the far corner, partially concealing a wash basin and vanity. There was no sign of violence. No overturned chairs, no broken glass, and no Lady Charlotte. Holmes stepped inside like a man entering a cathedral. He said nothing for several minutes, only moved from the window to the fireplace, to the wardrobe, then finally to the writing desk, where he paused. I watched as he withdrew his magnifying glass and examined the edge of the blotting paper. "Watson," he said, without turning, "kindly bring me the lamp from the hallway." I did as instructed, returning with the small oil lamp. Holmes adjusted the flame, held it beneath the blotter, and watched as the faint ghost of handwriting emerged upon the page. "Amend the will to reflect. Complete removal." He read aloud. Interesting. Mrs. Pendlebury looked stricken. She was rewriting it, she told me herself, in confidence. She meant to cut Reginald out entirely. Holmes gave a quiet hum of acknowledgement, then moved to the wardrobe. He opened it slowly, eyes scanning the contents, coats and gowns, neatly arranged. No sign of a suitcase taken. No overnight bag missing. She had no intention of leaving, but she couldn't have left, Clara repeated. "The windows are locked." We checked. Holmes turned and approached the nearest window. "Let us see what locked truly means." I watched as he examined the sash mechanism, the hinges, and the inside catch. Then he unlatched it, pushed it open, and leaned out into the pale, misty air. "This house backs onto a narrow mews," he observed. "A stable lane, just enough space for a narrow trapdoor. A quiet visitor." He stepped back and closed the window. "Tell me, Clarith's maid, Rose, where is she now?" "In the kitchen. I can fetch her." "Please do, Watson." "Look there on the edge of the windowsill." I leaned forward. A small mark, no larger than the smudge of a thumb, stained the sill. At first glance, it was no more than grime, but under the lens Holmes handed me, I saw something curious, a partial smear of wax. "Sealing wax?" I asked. "Possibly," Holmes said, "or perhaps candle wax. Either way, it does not belong. And yet it has been touched recently." When Mrs. Pendlebury returned, she brought with her a petite young woman in a plain gray dress and apron, her hands still dusted with flour from kneading dough. She curtsied nervously. "This is Rose," Clara said. "Tell Mr. Holmes everything you told the constable." Rose swallowed hard. "I came up to wake her, sir, like I always do. The door was locked, so I knocked. When she didn't answer, I fetched Mrs. Pendlebury. Mr. Willoughby forced the door open. She wasn't there. Had she said anything unusual the night before? She asked me to bring her blue diary from the drawing room. That was all. Holmes turned. And where is this diary now? Rose looked startled. I thought it would be in her desk, sir. It is not, Holmes replied. And therein lies one of our first absences of note. He turned to Mrs. Pendlebury. You mentioned that Lady Charlotte and her nephew quarreled frequently. Was he here that night, Kay? He had dinner downstairs and retired early. Said he had a headache. Then I believe. Watson, we must speak with Mr. Willoughby at once. As we descended the stairs, I saw the shift in Holmes's gait, the change from observation to engagement. The spark had been lit. Whatever clues lay in that still, silent room had been enough to ignite the engine of his mind. As Mrs. Pendlebury led us down the side hall to Reginald Willoughby's study, Holmes paused briefly and touched my arm. Did you note the scent in the bedroom, Watson? Only dust and lavender. Holmes gave a small nod. Precisely, but there was also the faintest trace of something bitter, something metallic, poison. I whispered. Possibly, Holmes murmured. Or something designed to mimic it. He straightened just as the door to the study opened, and we were ushered inside. Mr. Reginald Willoughby stood at the hearth, nursing a glass of brandy, his eyes sharp beneath neatly parted dark hair. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and the expression of a man playing the part of a grieving relative while deeply irritated by the inconvenience. Well, he said, raising an eyebrow, you must be Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Suppose it was only a matter of time before you arrived. Holmes offered a slight bow. In time, Mr. Willoughby, is precisely what I've come to unravel. Chapter 2. Mr. Reginald Willoughby did not invite us to sit, and Holmes, ever sensitive to such social nuances, remained standing with his back half turned to the fire, eyes narrowed in thought. I took position beside a bookshelf, feigning interest in a row of legal volumes that looked untouched, their spines uncreased by time or use. You say you've come to unravel time, Mr. Holmes, Reginald said with a thin smile, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. An amusing turn of phrase, though I wonder if it's more poetic than practical. Holmes gave no immediate reply. Instead, he studied the man in silence. Reginald's suit was immaculate, his cuffs perfectly pressed, and the scent of sandalwood cologne hung faintly in the air. A diamond stick pin gleamed at his tie, and his shoes, glossy black Oxfords, had been polished to a mirror finish. The very image of a man whose morning had not included worry. Poetry rarely interests me, Holmes said at last. But pattern, Mr. Willoughby pattern, is what I study. I find it particularly interesting when a person's account lacks one. Reginald's smile tightened. I've already given my statement to the police. I saw my aunt at dinner. She seemed in good spirits. I retired to my room shortly after 10. The next morning, she was gone. That's the pattern, as I understand it. Holmes cocked his head. And during that evening, did anything strike you as unusual? A knock at the door? Unfamiliar sounds? Strange scent? Reginald blinked. No, nothing out of the ordinary. Key. Yet, Lady Charlotte was rewriting her will, Holmes continued. You were aware, of course? Something flickered across Reginald's eyes gone, almost before it appeared. She mentioned it. She often said dramatic things to provoke a reaction. At her age, there's a flair for theatrics. She intended to remove your name, Holmes said quietly. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of a silver pocket clock on the mantel. Did she? Reginald said at last. Well then, that's unfortunate. Still, I imagine the current will stand until proven otherwise, unless... You mean to search the city for a vanished document and a vanished dowager? I intend to find both, Holmes said. And in doing so, I suspect I may discover a motive lurking close to home. Reginald straightened slightly. Is that a threat, Mr. Holmes? Holmes turned to the fire and, without looking at the man, replied, Not at all. But I find it curious how swiftly men speak of legality when morality becomes inconvenient. With that, he turned on his heel and moved toward the door. I followed, noting the slight twitch of Reginald's jaw as Holmes passed him without another word in the corridor. Holmes paused, drawing a small notebook from his coat. "Well, Watson," he said quietly, "what did you make of our charming host? Polished, controlled, too controlled, if I'm honest." He reminded me of a man standing trial, carefully rehearsing his innocence. "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "And did you notice the brandy?" "I did." "What of it?" He swirled it, but did not drink. His glass remained full. Perhaps a minor detail. Perhaps he's aware that his nerves cannot afford the dulling of alcohol. Returned to the bedroom once more, and Holmes set about a more precise examination. He moved with silent intensity, pulling gloves back on and lowering himself to inspect corners, cracks, and carving with the obsessive care of a watchmaker examining gears. At one point, paused beneath the bed, producing a slim envelope from beneath the rug. It was unsealed, the flap tucked loosely as though dropped in haste. Holmes opened it and extracted a single sheet. "Ah," he breathed. He held it to the light, scanning the short message. It was written in a neat, spidery hand. "You play with fire, Charlotte. That which is hidden must remain hidden. This is your only warning." There was no signature. Clara gasped when Holmes handed it to her. "I've never seen this before." "Okay, that's not her handwriting." "Indeed," Holmes said. "And we must now ask, who knew enough about Lady Charlotte's affairs to write such a note, and what were they threatening to expose?" He turned back to the desk, running his gloved fingers along the underside. Suddenly, he stopped, and with a small motion, slid open a hidden panel cleverly built into the base of the drawer. Inside was a single key and a length of blue silk ribbon. He held them up. A key, likely to another drawer, cabinet or safe, and the ribbon, I think, once adorned the missing diary. "Then someone removed it, deliberately," I said. Holmes nodded. "And either they left in great haste, wished us to think they had." He turned to Rose, who had returned to the doorway. "Is there a safe in the house?" "Sir," she said, "in the small study off the library. Only Lady Charlotte used it. Has it been opened since her disappearance?" "I don't think so." "Take us there, please." The study in question was a smaller, more intimate room than Reginald's, lined with shelves of theological texts and biographies of long-dead lords. A faded carpet muffled our steps as Holmes moved directly to the writing desk near the fireplace. Below, it was a cabinet with an inset iron door. Its face, plain but well-worn. Holmes inserted the key. It turned. The door swung open with a soft groan and revealed a space empty but for a single object, a glass vial, its half filled with a dark green fluid. Holmes picked it up gently, turning it in the light. "Curious," he muttered. "A bitter trace indeed." "What is it?" I asked. "Belladonna, I suspect, or some compound derived from it. The scent is unmistakable bitter almond, tinged with something metallic. Poison. Not lethal in this quantity, but enough to cause disorientation, confusion, perhaps hallucinations. Mixed into tea, say, it can make one believe they were dreaming, or convince others that a woman's mind had slipped." Clara looked horrified. "Then someone was drugging her." "Or preparing to," Holmes said. "Perhaps to create the illusion of madness, an ideal pretense for seclusion or disappearance." He replaced the vial and turned to me with a glint in his eye. "Watson, believe our ghostly vanishing has acquired its first footprint." We returned upstairs once more, and this time Holmes opened the dressing screen. There, neatly hung on a hook, was a blue velvet robe lined with silk and lightly scented. Holmes inspected the sleeve. "Ah!" He produced another of his small lenses and peered closely at the hem. Then he turned the robe inside out and examined the stitching along the lining. "What is it?" I asked. "There's a tear here, recent, but it was mended poorly and not by Lady Charlotte's maid. A man's hand, I'd wager. See here, the thread doesn't match." Sloppy work, intended to conceal haste. A knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Hudson, holding a telegram. "For you, Mr. Holmes. Just arrived." Holmes took it, read the single line, and handed it to me. "Body discovered, Thames Embankment. Female, matching description. Scotland Yard awaits." I felt a chill course through me. "Do you think?" I began. Holmes shook his head. "No, we're being led, Watson. But by whom and to where remains the true question." Key picked up his coat. "Come, the game is deepening. Let us see what the river has to say." The journey to the Thames Embankment was a grim one. Fog still clung to the city like a damp veil, and the sharp cries of gulls echoed overhead, interspersed with the occasional clatter of carriage wheels against cobblestones. We traveled in silence, save for the low murmur of Holmes occasionally tapping the edge of his cane against the floor of the hansom cab in a rhythm I recognized as mental calculation. His lips moved now and then, whispering incomplete phrases, fragments of thought not meant for mortal ears. I have often found the English fog a melancholy companion, but that morning it felt unusually spectral, as though it were not merely obscuring the streets, but waiting, listening. The body had been discovered near Blackfriars Bridge, pulled from the water by a pair of constables during the early hours. She had been wedged against a piling, tangled in reeds and debris. Scotland Yard had already cordoned off the area, and by the time we arrived, a small crowd of curious onlookers had begun to gather, held back by police. Lestrade met us with a furrowed brow and a stiff nod. "Holmes, Watson, didn't expect to see you down here so quick." Holmes offered a thin smile. "I received your telegram. I presume this is the woman found at first light." Lestrade gestured toward a canvas-covered form resting near a low retaining wall. "It matches the description. We were given female, gray hair, elegant clothing, though the water's done its damage. We haven't confirmed identity. No personal items. No handbag. No jewelry." "And how was she dressed?" Holmes asked. "Evening attire," Lestrade replied. "Dark gown, gloves still on. No coat, though." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. He knelt beside the form and gently lifted the canvas. "I will not commit to paper the full horror of what was revealed. But I must note this, though the face was pale and water-worn, it was unmistakably not Lady Charlotte Willoughby. The woman was older, perhaps in her 60s, with short-cropped white hair and delicate features now waxen in death. Her hands, gloved in kid leather, were folded neatly across her chest. Curious detail, considering the rough manner in which the river usually treated its dead. Holmes examined the fingers, the neckline of the dress, and then gently opened one eye with his thumb. "No ligature marks," he murmured. "No water in the lungs. Drowned." "I asked. Holmes shook his head. "No, she was dead before she entered the water." Lestrade crossed his arms. "You sure? There's no telltale frothing at the mouth? No skin distension? And no sand or silt beneath the fingernails?" This woman did not struggle. She was placed. He straightened and brushed off his knees. "This is not Lady Charlotte. A red herring meant to delay us, but a revealing one." I frowned. "Revealing in what way?" Holmes took out his notebook and scribbled several lines, then turned back to Lestrade. "Have your men search a priver. Look for any place where the embankment is unguarded, particularly if it's near a carriage path or mews. Whoever left her here did so quickly and with confidence." This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. Lestrade nodded. "I'll see to it." As we made our way back toward the street, Holmes slowed his pace, his eyes flicking toward the distant dome of St. Paul's through the mist. "She was meant to be found," he said softly, "but not recognized. You mean they wanted us to think she was Lady Charlotte? Holmes gave a curt nod. Enough resemblance to plant the seed of certainty, enough decay to prevent inspection. But it failed. Why? 'Cause they underestimated your eye for detail. No, Holmes said, smiling faintly. Because they acted in haste. In fear, Watson. Fear makes criminals clever, but never flawless. We walked in silence for several minutes. Then Holmes turned to me with sudden intensity. Tell me, Watson, what is the most efficient way to remove someone from a locked room without force or detection? I blinked. I suppose through a passage, a hidden door, correct? And if no such passage exists, then perhaps you remove the room instead of the person. Holmes nodded slowly, or convince the world that the person no longer exists at all, that they were never in the room to begin with. Illusion, Watson. This is a magician's trick of vanishing act. He hailed another cab. Where are we headed now? I asked as we climbed in. To a solicitor, Holmes said. Specifically, the man who handled Lady Charlotte's legal affairs. The chambers of Mr. Francis Dalrymple, Solicitor Law, were located in a narrow brick building just off Chancery Lane. The man himself was a stiff figure in his 60s, with a long face and ink-stained fingers. He greeted Holmes with a curious mix of suspicion and reverence, clearly familiar with his reputation. You understand, Mr. Holmes, he said, as we sat in his oak-paneled office, that legal matters concerning a client's estate are confidential. Holmes smiled. I'm not asking for the contents of the will merely for context. Dalrymple hesitated, then relented. Lady Charlotte was indeed in the process of drafting a new will. She had instructed me to remove her nephew, Reginald, as the primary heir. Okay. The new will named her companion, Mrs. Pendlebury, as the sole beneficiary. However, the document was not yet signed. The draft remains in my possession. When did she last communicate with you? Holmes asked. 3 days ago. She sent a message via her footman. Simple note requesting a postponement of the signing said. She had more to consider. Holmes leaned back. Did that strike you as unusual? Dalrymple rubbed his chin a bit. She had been decisive before. It seemed out of character. Holmes stood. Thank you, Mr. Dalrymple. You've been most helpful. So we stepped into the street once more, Holmes said. So now we know. Reginald had every reason to act before the new will was formalized. The timing is damning. But you don't believe he murdered her, I said. I believe he wanted to, Holmes replied. But I suspect he lacked the subtlety. Hey, this, he gestured toward the fog around us. This feels orchestrated by someone far more cunning. Clara Pendlebury. Holmes paused, considering. She has motive now, but not then. And I find it hard to believe a woman of such nervous disposition could orchestrate a disappearance so elegant. Then who? Holmes looked at me sharply. That, Watson, is what we must now determine. But Mark, Neithis is not merely a case of greed. There's something older at play here. Something buried. The note, the diary, the bitter compoundal point to a deeper fear. And until we uncover what Lady Charlotte was hiding, we will never understand who wanted her gone. We stood in the street, the fog swirling at our feet like restless ghosts. Holmes lit a cigarette and stared into the mist. She vanished into a locked room. The dead woman was placed in her stead. He said, That is not murder, Watson. Lot. Is it then? Holmes exhaled a stream of smoke. A performance. We returned to Baker Street in the late afternoon, weary in body, but electrified in mind. The fog, though thinner than before, still clung to the city's bones. Street lamps glowed faintly in the gathering dusk, and the air had the damp chill of an evening determined to sink into one's coat. As I shrugged off my gloves and took a seat by the fire, Holmes lit his pipe and began pacing the length of our sitting room in that agitated silence I had come to know so well, the kind that preceded a mental breakthrough, or, equally often, a night of frenzied violin playing and unanswered muttering. She postponed the will's signing. Kata, he said aloud, though to no one in particular. 3 days ago, that was the pivot. I looked up. She had made up her mind, hadn't she, to cut Reginald out? Then she changed her mind, or said she did. Why? Holmes didn't answer directly. Instead, he crossed to the desk, pulled open a drawer, and retrieved the envelope we had found beneath Lady Charlotte's bedchamber rug. He slid the anonymous letter free once again and examined it beneath the lamplight. You see this ink, Watson? I took the sheet and held it closer. A rich black, common type, I'd say, exactly. Far too common to clean. And that's precisely the problem. Holmes sat down across from me, steepling his fingers. Lady Charlotte was a woman of habit, old money, old manners. She favored brown iron gold ink, the sort that takes time to dry and fades slowly to a mottled sienna. Her correspondence is consistent, even her shopping lists. At this, he pointed to the letter, was written with modern aniline ink, the kind found in the cheapest stationer's supplies. It's not just a different ink, it's an ink she would have disdained. You mean the letter wasn't hers? Holmes smiled faintly. No, Watson. We already knew that. What, it wasn't even written in her house. A silence settled between us, broken only by the low crackle of coal in the grate. I leaned forward. So what does it tell us? That the threat, what is hidden, must remain hidden, was penned in haste by someone not in possession of Lady Charlotte's usual tools. A guest, perhaps, or a servant acting covertly. There was a sharp rap at the door just then. Mrs. Hudson entered with a parcel in hand. Telegram for you, Mr. Holmes. Delivered by messenger. Holmes took it, eyes scanning the brief message, his brows lifted. Well, what is it? I asked. It's from Inspector Fowler, he said. He had the sense to check with the registry office. Seemed the woman pulled from the Thames this morning was not a stranger to Lady Charlotte, after all. Name was Miss Irene Stroud, formerly of the same parish. Once a housemaid at the Willoughby estate 20 years ago. That's no coincidence, I said. Nothing in this case is, Holmes replied. Miss Stroud vanished from service under suspicion of theft. A brooch was missing, later recovered, but the scandal remained. Lady Charlotte, ever concerned with appearances, dismissed her without reference. He stood again, energized. Watson, I believe our dead woman is the key. Whoever left her there was counting on anonymity, not irony. I rose as well. Where to now? To the servants' ledger, Holmes said. We need to speak with the housekeeper, and quickly. By early evening, we were once more at Grosvenor Square. This time ushered not to the grand parlors, but to the servants' winger. Narrow corridor with stone floors and plain walls. Mrs. Aldgate, the housekeeper, was a woman of formidable presence, with iron gray hair in a tight bun and a gaze sharp enough to slice paper. Miss Stroud, she said, frowning as Holmes questioned her. Yes, I remember her. Quiet girl. Worked here nearly 3 years when I was still new, but she left suddenly. There was talk of her stealing something, though the truth of it was always murky. Did she ever make contact again? Holmes asked. Not that I know of, though I believe she wrote once, maybe 2 years ago. Begged for forgiveness, said she was unwell and poor. Lady Charlotte never replied. Holmes nodded slowly. Do you keep old letters? Candid, K. Filing room behind the drawing room. The drawing room. May I see them? Mrs. Aldgate hesitated, then relented. If Lady Charlotte were here, she'd have said no. Okay. Things being what they are. Okay. She led us upstairs, through a narrow servant stairwell, and into a small office lined with drawers. She withdrew a thin bundle tied with ribbon, labeled correspondence. Misk. Holmes thumbed through them quickly until he found what he sought. The letter from Irene. Stroud was dated nearly 2 years prior. Script was neat, sorrowful. I am dying, madame, and I ask only for peace. I did not take the brooch. It was Reginald who planted it in my things to shame me. He laughed when I cried. I was 17. Holmes read the words aloud. The room grew cold. That bastard, I muttered. Holmes handed the letter to Mrs. Aldgate. Did you know about this? The housekeeper shook her head, visibly shaken. No, but I believe her. She was always gentle. Reginald he was cruel when young, sharp-tongued, entitled. Holmes turned to me. Now we know the truth. Irene Stroud had motive to confront Lady Charlotte. She may have come to the house. Perhaps she even gained access to the upper floors, possibly with help. Clara Pendlebury asked. Possibly, Holmes said. Someone else owned. Staff who pitied her. But something went wrong. I suspect Lady Charlotte did not receive her with kindness. She was murdered. Perhaps she died from illness, and someone saw opportunity in it. To use her body as a decoy, I said, to make us believe it was Lady Charlotte who had died. Holmes nodded grimly. It was a cruel trick, but not a hasty one. Someone planned this. Someone who knew both women. Someone who had something to lose. And Reginald asked, could he have? Holmes raised a hand. He's a scoundrel, Watson. But this required finesse, planning, and most of all, fear. Not of discovery, but of truth. He turned toward the hallway, eyes gleaming. Back to Baker Street, Watson. I need silence. I need to think. That night was long. Holmes barely spoke, save to request a specific volume on criminal handwriting and another on stage illusion. He scribbled furiously in his notebook and paced like a man possessed at midnight. He finally stopped. Watson, he said, voice low but certain. There is something wrong with the diary. The missing one, Dant. It was velvet bound, blue ribboned, but more importantly, it was supposedly last seen in Lady Charlotte's possession. Yet, no one can say they saw her writing in it during her final evening. What does that tell you? It tells me the diary never reached her bedroom, Holmes said. It was intercepted, and that means someone feared what she was about to record. About Reginald? No, Holmes said darkly. About someone far more dangerous. The following day began with a letter slid beneath our door. Unassuming envelope, cream-colored and without crest. Holmes found it as he stirred from a restless nap upon the divan. The discarded embers of his pipe still smoldering faintly in the ashtray. He knelt down and opened it silently, his features tightening as he read. A summons of sorts, he said, from Mr. Willoughby. I blinked. He wishes to speak with you. He's invited me in fact, to a private supper this evening. He claims to have uncovered something relevant to Lady Charlotte's disappearance. Do you believe him? Holmes tilted his head. No, but I believe he wants me to believe him. That's far more interesting. We passed the afternoon in quiet preparation. Holmes spent 2 hours cross-referencing names from Lady Charlotte's parish donations with staff rosters and criminal registers from as far back as 1869. He took particular interest in a name, a barely registered dead word Mabrea. He underlined thrice and circled with a thin blue pencil. When I pressed him for details, he only muttered, if I'm right, he's the thread. Pull him, and the tapestry comes down. By the time we returned to Grosvenor Square, the gaslights had bloomed across the city like distant fireflies. Butler greeted us with the same formal chill as before, but his eyes lingered a moment too long on Holmes' coat pocket, where the detective had very deliberately allowed the outline of his revolver to protrude. We were led not to the dining room, but to the drawing room, where Reginald Willoughby awaited us wine glass in hand, as ever, though its contents remained untouched. Holmes noticed, of course. He noticed everything, Mr. Holmes, Reginald said. gesturing magnanimously. "Doctor, thank you for coming. Please do sit. I'd rather like your take on something most curious." He reached to a side table and picked up a small, polished key. "This," he said, "was found beneath the floorboard in Lady Charlotte's private writing room. One of the maids claims it was unearthed during routine dusting, though how dusting leads to floorboard prying, I haven't the faintest idea." He handed the key to Holmes, who examined it under the lamplight. It was silver, narrow, and engraved faintly with the maker's mark. "A latchkey," Holmes said. "Custom cut." "Indeed," Reginald replied. "But to what, I wonder?" Holmes said nothing. He reached into his pocket and drew out a tiny magnifier. "Note the wear on the teeth," he murmured. "Frequent use, but the shank is entirely clean. No oil, no dust. Someone polished it recently." He looked up sharply. "This wasn't dropped. It was planted." Reginald raised an eyebrow. "Planted? For what purpose?" "To shift suspicion away from the guilty and toward a new, artificial trail," Holmes said. "Tell me, Mr. Willoughby, how many of your staff still carry old keys to the upper floors?" "Only Mrs. Aldgate and the butler Griggs. Everyone else uses passkeys. Had the locks updated last year. And Mrs. Pendlebury, she wouldn't need a key. She had the run of the house." Holmes passed the key to me, and I examined it. There was something oddly intimate about it, as though it had been gripped in desperation. Worn but not ancient, it felt like an object recently drawn from hiding. Something perhaps so open a room, not meant to be entered. "Did Lady Charlotte keep a safe outside her study?" Holmes asked suddenly. Reginald looked momentarily confused. "Not that I'm aware of. No small vaults, no secured drawers, not to my knowledge." Holmes gave a tight nod. "Thank you. That's all for now." We returned to Baker Street well after dark. Holmes was more restless than usual. He paced the floor in sharp diagonals, occasionally halting to jot fragments in his notebook, words like confessor, servants, ledger, kick, and buried diary appearing in bold loops. Finally, he said, "Watson, do you recall the ledger we examined? In the housekeeper's office, of course. There was one entry I now regret glossing over. A temporary butler hired just over 2 years ago, 3 weeks of service. Fired for unauthorized entry into private rooms." "I do remember that," I said. "His name was Mowbray." Holmes snapped his fingers. "Yes, Edward Mowbray. I believe he was the true intended recipient of the buried diary." I frowned. "What connection would he have with Lady Charlotte?" "None," Holmes replied. "But with Irene Stroud, that's another matter. I cross-referenced their names in parish registries. They shared a tenancy in Lambeth 4 years ago. A woman and a man, unwed, living under different surnames, but listed as cohabitants. You'd think they were lovers? At the very least, co-conspirators, possibly more. When Miss Stroud returned to Grosvenor Square, she wasn't alone in purpose. She came bearing a message, and someone tried to stop it from reaching its mark. He crossed to the fireplace and stood before it, the flames catching the angles of his face in stark relief. The key was Mowbray's. That much is certain. And someone retrieved it after his dismissal. Someone who knew where it had been hidden beneath the floorboard. Must have been Lady Charlotte herself who buried it there as a precaution. But if she feared him, why not alert the authorities? Perhaps she once trusted him. Or perhaps she feared what he might expose. Holmes turned to me suddenly. "Watson, how often do we confuse silence with dignity? How many aristocratic houses bury their secrets beneath lace curtains and charity functions?" I said nothing. Holmes strode to the desk, where he pulled from the drawer the threatening letter again. "Note the final line. This is your only warning, not a warning. The warning, final, as though delivered not in rage, but in mourning. You think it was a lover's farewell?" I think it was guilt. He looked at me, face suddenly grave. But not from Irene, from someone else. He tapped the letter. The hand is feminine, but the fear is deeper than scandal. This wasn't about theft or revenge. It was about a secret, a shared one, buried decades ago. I leaned forward. Do you know what it is? I have a strong suspicion, Holmes said, but I need proof. And for that, he gave a rare, tight smile. We shall bait a hook. That night, Holmes sent out 3 telegrams. The first to Inspector Fowler, the second to the solicitor, Mr. Dalrymple, and the third, in code, to an unnamed contact in Whitehall. I asked no questions. I knew better. By morning, he had received 2 replies. One was brief. Parish birth records, confirmed guardianship transfer. March 1854, from Charlotte Willoughby to Aldecay. S. Source, Diocesan Archive, Clerkenwell. Holmes folded the note and placed it carefully in his inner coat pocket. The last piece is falling into place, he said. Watson, tonight we lay our trap. All of them, Reginald, Mrs. Pendlebury, even Griggs, the butler, will be present. We will do what must be done. And what is that? Holmes' expression was unreadable. It revealed not merely a criminal, but a ghost. Chapter 03. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive. A dull mist hanging low over the rooftops, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Holmes, as was his custom, rose early and stood by the window in his dressing gown, watching. Baker Street stirred to life. He had not slept. I could tell from the untouched pillow and the restless energy with which he drummed his fingers against the sill. I sipped my tea, waiting for him to speak. I didn't single quotes. Finally, I broke the silence. You believe Lady Charlotte's illness was contrived? Not contrived, he replied, eyes stilled on the street below. Quapped. You think she was poisoned? No, I think her symptoms were real. But I think the conclusion of madness was convenient to someone. He turned, suddenly. Locket. Watson. Where is it? In your satchel, I believe. He retrieved it, placed it upon the table, and opened it once more. Inside remained the tiny, folded scrap of linen paper, now beginning to fray at the edges. On it, the faded ink, still red. It's the one who remembers. Holmes removed the paper with a pair of tweezers and held it to the light. Do you see the watermark? I leaned closer. It looks ... like a harp. Indeed, an Irish harp. This paper comes from Killiney, south of Dublin, a specific station, McDevitt and Sons, known for producing personal letter paper in small, bespoke batches. The presence of the harps suggests this was not a note dashed off in haste. I frowned, but Lady Charlotte had no known connection to Ireland, nor did Irene Strouder, so we've been led to believe. He replaced the note and snapped the locket shut with a sharp click. Come, Watson, we're going to visit the solicitor, Mr. Dunstow. No, said Holmes, with a small, bitter smile. Dunstow is but a gatekeeper. We are going to speak with the locksmith. The man in question, Mr. Alphonse Pritchard, ran a small shop tucked between a tobacconist and a pub just off Ebury Street. His sign read, Pritchard & Sons, Precision Mechanisms since 1847. Holmes pushed open the door, setting off a delicate chime, and within moments we were greeted by the locksmith himself, tall, stooped, with silver spectacles perched low on his nose. Mr. Holmes, he said, without surprise. I thought you might come. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Then you know what I've come to ask? Pritchard nodded, then glanced at me. You'd best come into the back. In the workshop, surrounded by drawers of tiny screws and gears, Pritchard held up a worn ledger. Okay. He opened it to a page dated 6 years prior, commissioned by Edward Willoughby, he said, tapping the entry with one long finger. A custom locket built to hold a hidden note. The note, I was told, was to be delivered after the lady's death. Holmes leaned forward. Which lady? I assumed he meant his wife. But now I am not so sure. He pulled a small cloth from his pocket and unfolded it to reveal something curious, a delicate ivory-handled glove. I kept this, he said softly. It came in with the locket to measure fit for a lady's wrist, but it didn't match Lady Charlotte's proportions. Too small, too small. Holmes took the glove with surprising care, turning it over, inspecting the stitching, the faint initials sewn into the interior cuff. Eyes, I gasped. Irene Stroud. Holmes nodded. It was her locket, then, or rather, his, for her. Gave us a look that was not quite confusion, not quite fear. I was told never to speak of it, but I remembered the day he came back weeks later asking if I still had the mold, said the lady had passed and the matter was settled. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Did he seem ... grieved? No, he seemed ... relieved. Thus, we returned to Baker Street. Holmes grew quiet again, tapping the locket in his palm. I posited a theory yesterday, he said as we walked. That Lady Charlotte, perhaps maddened by grief or betrayal, turned against Irene Stroud. Can now, I believe the opposite. You'd think she tried to protect her. I think she died trying. Back in our sitting room, Holmes laid the glove next to the locket and sat back with his steepled fingers pressed against his lips. There is one name, he murmured, that appears only once in the will. A Henry Stroud. No relation given. A modest inheritancy, enough to suggest neither disdain nor deep affection. I furrowed my brow. I don't recall the name. Precisely, because it was tucked into the list of charitable bequests, as though it did not matter. But it must. Holmes stood and moved to the bookshelf, pulling down an old parish registry from the Grosvenor Square archives. One eye remembered us referencing during an unrelated matter some years back. He flipped through its worn pages, then paused. There, he said. Baptismal record. Henry Edward Stroud, born May 6, 1883. Mother, Irene Stroud. Father, not listed. I leaned over the page, heart pounding. That would make him ... 24 now. Holmes nodded. Just old enough to inherit. Why wasn't this mentioned in the court proceedings? Because no one wanted it to be. That night, as the gaslights flickered and the fog returned to fold itself along the rooftops, Holmes stared long into the fire. You see now, Watson, he said softly, why she had to disappear? I did not reply. Lady Charlotte loved Irene like a sister, perhaps more, for society would not permit her to protect a woman disgraced by illegitimacy and scandal, and Edward Willoughby could not risk exposure, so she arranged the inheritance. Quietly hid the boy, buried the evidence in bequests and burned correspondence, all except the locket and the glove. I asked. Holmes looked at me, his eyes strangely tired. She left it with the locksmith, he said, in case someone ever cared enough to look. Section 5. False Trails and Suspense Voices in the Fog. Narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The days that followed were consumed by a mounting sense of disquiet for the case of Lady Agatha Mortlake's disappearance. What Holmes had begun privately referring to as the Moonstone Widow affair refused to bend to even his formidable mind in a satisfactory manner. I do not like puzzles that declare themselves prematurely. Holmes muttered one evening as we returned to Baker Street after a fruitless interview with the Mortlake estate's disinherited cousin, Augustus Bramley. They leave too little space for the mind to roam. Indeed, Bramley had provided plenty of pomp and little substance. He was a thick-set man with oily fingers and a theatrical mustache, and he denied any knowledge of Lady Mortlake's vanishing with such insistent cheer that I could not help but be suspicious. She was always a nervous woman, Dr. Bramley had said, lifting a port glass he had no intention of sharing. fancied herself watched, heard voices in the ivy, said the portraits whispered at night. Eccentricity, I dare say, or gin. There was always a bottle hidden somewhere, a convenient brand of madness. Holmes had murmured to me outside the man's drawing room, but not an authentic one. Bramley had motive aplenty. He stood to gain the remainder of the Mortlake estate should Lady Agatha be declared deceased and without issue. Yet even Holmes seemed reluctant to commit to the theory. No, Watson, he had said as we rolled back in silence through the mist-laden lanes of Kensington. He is too aware of what we are meant to suspect, and that is always the mark of a performance. It was then, on that cold ride through the still heart of London, that Holmes first voiced a curious hesitation. There is a hand behind all this, he murmured. Not the obvious one, not Bramley, nor the coachman, nor the housekeeper. Someone we have not yet seen, perhaps someone no longer within the house at all. But that would imply the entire household has been duped or complicit, I objected, or distracted. The best concealment, Watson, is always accompanied by noise. He would say no more. The next morning brought rain in fitful spits. I had barely poured myself a cup of tea when Holmes burst into the sitting room, soaked to the bone, but with his eyes alight. Watson, you will accompany me to Limehouse. Limehouse, Opium Den, Ratcliffe Highway. I believe the voice in the ivy may have had an address after all. This cryptic declaration gave me no great comfort. Nevertheless, we found ourselves that afternoon navigating the labyrinth of London's eastern doxa, place of shadows, sailors, and sin. The stench of brine and coal hung thick over every corner. Holmes led us down an alley so narrow I could feel brick on both shoulders before rapping twice on a splintered red door set between two shuttered shops. An old Chinese man opened it just wide enough to show yellowed teeth and one ink-black eye. Tell Lo Fang, the violinist, is here, Holmes said. I stared at him, dumbfounded. Violinist. The man blinked slowly, then vanished. After a moment, the door creaked open and we were permitted entry. Inside, the den was a tableau of misery. Men lay in makeshift cots, some barely clothed, others muttering in dreamsick stupor. The air was clotted with the sickly sweet aroma of opium. Yet Holmes did not flinch. He walked with practiced ease, nodding once to a young boy in the corner whose bare feet slapped noiselessly against the damp floorboards as he led us through a curtain of beaded rope. Lo Fang was not a figure I had expected. He was no wizened peddler, but a man of maybe 35, with eyes like twin daggers and the bearing of an aristocrat disguised as a pauper. Holmes bowed slightly. I followed suit, uncertain whether to offer my hand. Mr. Holmes, Lo Fang said in perfect English, your strings were missed. Your silence is ... ominous. I'll bring my bow next time, Holmes said coolly. For now, I require your assistance. What do you seek? A voice, a whisper that carries through ivy, a name spoken in dreams, perhaps a man with many names. Lo Fang inclined his head. You believe your lady has come here? I believe someone wanted us to think she did. The exchange was brief, but in it lay an understanding that chilled me. Holmes was not here for indulgence, but for information of the kind traded in shadows and secrets. Lo Fang finally nodded. A woman tall, shrouded, and veiled was seen 2 nights ago on the embankment. She walked without hesitation and vanished under the old sea wall. It is said she carried a package. Was she alone? A boy followed her, but no boy returned. Holmes stiffened. What did she carry? Pox. No bigger than a Bible. Some said it wept. We left in silence. Back on the streets, Holmes lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. I had rarely seen him so deeply unnerved. A voice in the ivy. A woman in mourning. weeping box, I said quietly. It all sounds like madness. No, Holmes said. It sounds like misdirection. Okay. But one must ask what is being hidden behind the story of her disappearance. Surely not just the disappearance itself. No, Watson, he said. There is something else, something more valuable than a woman's life. I cannot fathom what he meant. That night, as I sat by the fire, watching the flames claw upward into the black chimney, Holmes scrawled furiously across 3 sheets of notepaper. He sent one to the Yard, another to the local coroner's office in Westminster, and a third to a private antiquities dealer I had never heard of. I questioned none of it. Tomorrow, he said, without looking up, we return to Mortlake Hall. I believe it is time to look in the one place no one ever truly does. And where's that? I asked. The grave was not the bloody ledger or the reliquary that finally drew me out of London again. Was the flower, carnation, pinned carefully to a man's lapel, spotted on a platform at King's Cross Station. He was unremarkable at first glance, mid-30s, blind hair, angular face, and wire-rimmed spectacles. He wore a long gray overcoat and carried a newspaper under one arm. Would have been no reason to take notice, save for the single red bloom stitched neatly to his collar, precisely as Holmes had warned. He glanced at me once, not long, enough to confirm recognition, but it was enough. Then he vanished aboard the 9:15 express bound for Dover. I stood, frozen, the memory of Holmes' final note pulsing in my hand like a second heartbeat. Trust no one wearing a red carnation. By the time I returned to Baker Street and retrieved the spare revolver from Holmes' locked cabinet, the decision had already formed in my mind. I arrived in Vienna. 2 days later, the man with the red carnation had passed through customs using the name Michael Renstadt, and his destination, according to shipping logs, was a hotel on the western edge of the city near the old University District. Holmes once said that Vienna was the place where shadows wore suits and secrets smoked cigars in glass parlors. I checked into a modest pension under a false name, Dr. John Kesterland, set about retracing the man's steps. Renstadt had paid cash, forwarding address, the companions, but the concierge at the hotel remembered the flower. Very precise, the old woman said in clipped German. He pinned it fresh every morning. Never a wilted petal. 3 days passed before I saw him again. He emerged from a side door of the National Library shortly after dusk. He had shed the overcoat, but still wore the red carnation. I followed him at first at a distance, then closer, into the older streets that looped behind the Hofburg Palace. And then, to my surprise, he stopped. Dr. Watson, he said, without turning. You're as quiet as they say. I froze. You know who I am. He turned then, slowly, and offered me the faintest smile. I know who you were. The question is, do you know who you are now? The man introduced himself as Emil Sauer, former archivist turned translator once attached to the Imperial War Records, but now freelance. Such a word could be trusted in. This context. He led me into a cafe beneath the Rathausplatz, dimly lit and filled with the scent of strong tobacco and stale lemon pastries. We sat in the corner beneath the plaster relief of Franz Joseph. I knew Holmes, he said, without ceremony. We met twice, once in Trieste, once again in Naples. He told me you would come. He left no message, I said, only warnings, a ledger, a reliquary, and a flower. Sauer nodded. Then he told you everything and nothing. Typical. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. Upon it, a copy of an etching the spine of the book I had found, beneath the Bourbon vaults. The eye. The inverted crown. This symbol, he said, dates back farther than you think. It's not British. It's not even colonial. It's ecclesiastical. Hidden in plain sight in churches across Europe, most notably in the frescoes near the library of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. You're saying it's religious? I'm saying it was repurposed. The church once used it to denote forbidden knowledge texts banned from circulation. That mark appeared on ledgers kept by cardinals during the papal schisms. Later, it was co-opted by guilds of silent historians, record keepers, who took payment not to reveal truth, but to bury it. And now, he leaned closer. Now, someone has resurrected it. A new order, not spiritual, not national, but bound by preservation of power. K. I stared at him. The reliquary was one of many, he continued. K. A node in a network of objects that, taken together, form a record of everything the world has. Chosen to forget assassinations that never made it to print. Treaties signed in poison. Truths bartered for stability. My throat was dry, and Holmes, Sarah sat back, exhaling slowly. He didn't want to bring the network down. He wanted to understand it. But they saw him as a threat, and he knew they would. We parted that night with no promises. Sauer gave me a list of 5 names, 5 cities, 5 items believed to be linked to the larger archive. He told me he would remain in Vienna until the leaves changed or the wrong man ordered the right drink. He left me with a final warning. If you see 2 men with gray gloves and a red umbrella, do not run. They'll expect it. I returned to my lodgings in silence, the list trembling in my breast pocket. Holmes had walked into a labyrinth, and now I stood at the edge of it. Section 7. The Trap Beneath the Ivy, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. It was nearly midnight when Holmes stood beneath the dead, ivy-cloaked archway on the southern wall of Mortlake Hall, arms folded behind his back, his silhouette unmoving in the pale shimmer of moonlight. We had arrived unannounced that evening, despite the hour, claiming unfinished business. The housekeeper, a doorwoman named Mrs. Clay, had protested, but Holmes had swept past her with all the confidence of a man who knew the manor better than those who kept it. There was something ghost-like about Mortlake Hall at night. The windows gleamed like vacant eyes. The wind carried strange echoes from the neglected garden. In the silence between gusts, one could almost imagine the voice Lady Agatha once claimed to hear a whisper tangled in ivy, beckoning her toward madness. I believe the time is right, Watson, Holmes said without turning. Our prey has been fattened on fear and self-righteousness. We simply offer him the final morsel. And what exactly is that morsel? A chance to act. He gestured for me to follow him through the narrow side path that led to the rear of the estate. Our boots crunched on gravel. The air smelled of wet leaves and soil. Holmes had spent the earlier part of the day reviewing the hall's blueprints in the city archives, poring over its renovations across decades. Observe the ivy here, Holmes whispered, drawing my attention to the corner wall near the hedge maze. Thicker than elsewhere, unnaturally so, and yet no root damage. Watson, nature doesn't coil without cause. So I want to arrange this. He stepped forward, pulled aside a heavy curtain of vine, and revealed something utterly unexpected. A bricked-over archway, only faintly visible beneath weather-worn mortar. It at once led to a small crypto-burial vault used, according to Holmes, for the Mortlake hunting hounds of decades past. No one ever buries dogs this far from the kennel, Holmes muttered, unless they intend to keep something buried. As we examined the area, Holmes produced a tiny sliver of wood from his coat Paquita fragment retrieved days earlier from the estate's burned refuse pile. He compared it to the frame of the ivy-covered trellis, a perfect match. Someone had staged the ivy to cover what they hoped would remain hidden forever. But who? I asked. And why? To what end? That, Holmes said, stepping back, is what will let him tell us. At Holmes' instruction, we returned to the house and requested Mr. Bramley's presence. He came wearing a velvet dressing robe, and an expression of polished irritation. "It's rather late for theatrics, Mr. Holmes," he said stiffly. "I do hope this isn't another ghost story." "Quite the opposite," Holmes replied. "I've arranged to deliver something Lady Agatha herself intended to give to the crown. It arrives at dawn." Bramley blinked, then shifted uncomfortably. "You mean the reliquary?" "The Moonstone reliquary," Holmes said with deliberate precision. "Yes, or what remains of it." "I was told it was a myth," Bramley said, voice suddenly strained. Holmes tilted his head. "Told? By whom?" Bramley hesitated. "By Agatha, years ago. Curious. She wrote to the British Museum last month requesting authentication." The color drained from Bramley's cheeks. "I see," Holmes said softly. "Then I imagine the person who silenced her would be quite eager to retrieve it before it becomes evidence." "Ah." He said no more, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Bramley excused himself moments later, mumbling something about brandy and sleep. Holmes turned to me. "It begins now." We took our positions shortly before 2. In the morning, Holmes stationed himself behind the fountain near the hedge line, cloaked in shadows. I crouched beneath the balustrade of the west wing balcony, my service revolver resting beside me. In the quiet, every rustle felt like thunder. Every creak became a warning. Hours passed. Then, tapped precisely 3:17 by Holmes' watch week, saw a movement. A figure emerged from the house by the eastern servants' entrance, wrapped in a long coat, who had pulled low. He carried something, a lantern and a small satchel. He moved with cautious steps, glancing back often, then proceeded straight toward the ivy-covered crypt wall. Holmes gave no signal. He didn't need to. We watched as the man removed a crowbar from the satchel and began to pry at the sealed bricks behind the ivy. Not with panic, but practiced ease. He had done this before. Within minutes, a hollow thunk echoed out. He reached in and withdrew a lacquered wooden box. Holmes stepped from the shadows. "Mr. Bramley said coolly, "You needn't open it. You already know what's inside." The man spun around, but it wasn't Bramley. It was the footman Marsh, the former soldier. Same man Holmes had pointedly avoided questioning too deeply in our earlier visit. Marsh froze. I don't you?" "Drugged her," Holmes said, stepping forward. "You made her believe she was losing her mind. You forged the footsteps in the hall, the whispers, the scent trails. You planned the disappearance meticulously, but not alone." The man's expression faltered. "I want the name," Holmes said, his voice flat. Now, Marsh's lips trembled. "He promised we'd be gone by morning, that no one would come this far, that it would die with her." "Who promised?" "Mr. Bramley." We took Marsh into custody within the hour, detaining him with the assistance of the local constable Holmes had alerted in advance. Holmes instructed the constable to secure Marsh in a carriage until Scotland Yard arrived. Back inside the hall, Holmes strode to the study and found Bramley still feigning sleep in his chair. Without ceremony, Holmes tossed the lacquered box onto his lap. "Perhaps you'd care to explain why your manservant was unsealing a false crypt in the dead of night." Bramley stared at the reliquary, his lips parted. Then slowly, his hand moved, not to defend, not to deny, but to steady himself. "I suppose," he said with dreadful quiet, "there's nothing left to pretend." Chapter 04. It was a cold morning when we returned to Mortlake Hall, colder still in spirit. The air was heavy with the scent of damp stone and frost-laced bramble. Its qualm and the manner seemed even more withdrawn than before. Its once-proud face now sullen, like a mourner who refuses to speak of the departed. Holmes had barely uttered a word during our carriage ride from London. He sat with arms folded, his gaze fixed not on the passing fields, but some unfathomable point beyond them. Occasionally, he murmured phrases to himself, fragments of letters, names, times, a Latin motto. I did not disturb him, quite seen this intensity before, on the eve of resolution. Upon our arrival, Holmes requested an audience with Mr. Bramley. We met us in the study with feigned surprise and a touch of defensiveness. Again, gentlemen, Bramley said, adjusting the brocade waistcoat stretched taut over his paunch. Surely Scotland Yard has better things to do than chase ghosts in ivy. We are not here for the yard, Holmes said briskly. We are here for the portrait. Bramley blinked. The portrait. The one of the late Lord Mortlake, hanging in the upstairs gallery. You had it moved into storage 3 weeks ago. Yes, I did. The face disturbed the staff. So it did, Holmes said, but only because someone ensured it would. I watched Bramley's color subtly shift, though he laughed a moment later. Well, you're welcome to view it. Though I suspect the Lord himself won't speak much to your investigation. No, Holmes replied, but someone else already has. We followed a footman up the creaking stairs to the portrait gallery, which smelled of wax and rot. Dust choked the corners. Sunlight filtered weakly through long, gray curtains, and there, leaning against the far wall, was the massive, dust-shrouded canvas of Lord Mortlake in his youth astride, a black horse, saber-drawn, a stormy battlefield behind him. Holmes approached the frame slowly, brushing off the cover, then stepping back. There, he said, pointing. Do you see it, Watson? I stepped forward, squinting. At first glance, there was nothing amiss. But as I leaned closer, I noticed something unusual beneath the heavy golden trim of the portrait. A small crack in the wood, almost invisible, just below the ornate right-hand corner. Holmes gently pressed against it with a sharp click. A hidden panel popped free. Inside was a hollow recess just wide enough for a small box, and there, wrapped in aged velvet, sat a lacquered chest. Its sides were inlaid with jade and ivory, and on the lid, the unmistakable inlay of a moonstone cut into the shape of a weeping eye. Holmes lifted it gently, turning it over in his hands. Bramley, who had followed us in, now stood utterly still. His eyes had gone glassy. What is that? He said in a voice that no longer pretended at confidence. This, Holmes said calmly, is the Mortlake reliquary, lost during the Indian Rebellion of 1857, rumored to have been filled with opium-drenched gemstones smuggled back from Lucknow, used in secret rituals, possibly even murders. A family legend, a curse, a treasure. Bramley said nothing, but his breathing quickened. It was stolen, then hidden, a secret passed down, buried in plain sight, and recently recovered by Lady Agatha, who was planning to surrender it to the crown before she vanished. Holmes turned, fixing him with his piercing gaze. She threatened your future, Mr. Bramley, and so you made her vanish. That's absurd, Bramley hissed, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. You had motive, Holmes continued, but not the skill. So you involved another, someone clever enough to turn her fear into full-blown delusion. Someone who whispered through the ivy, who faked footsteps and staged the opium trail to Limehouse. Someone who knew the reliquary would never be found so long as the portrait remained untouched. Bramley said nothing. He merely swallowed hard. It was your manservant, Marsh, Holmes said with sudden precision. A former soldier, once stationed in Delhi, whose pension was purchased by you. He administered the laudanum, a tea, forged the letters, and he buried her in the sealed garden crypt used by the Mortlake hounds, a place no one would search. At this, Bramley broke. You can't prove that, he said hoarsely. There's no body. You have nothing. On the contrary, Holmes said, producing a telegram from his breast pocket. The Yard uncovered the remains this morning, and Marsh was arrested as he tried to board a steamer in Tilbury He confessed to acting under your instruction. Bramley collapsed into a nearby chair, his face drained of all color. Why? I asked softly, more to myself than to either of them. She was your kin. She would have sold it, Bramley whispered, staring not at us but the weeping moonstone, given it to museums, shamed a family, destroyed what little name we had left. There are worse crimes than obscurity, Mr. Bramley, Holmes said. Later that evening, we returned to Baker Street. The moon hung pale and indifferent above the rooftops. Holmes placed the recovered reliquary upon the mantel, where it glinted silently in the firelight. So ends the tale of the Moonstone Widow. Sit, still dazed by the day's events. And to think, it all began with a whisper in the ivy. Holmes did not answer immediately. He stood by the window, staring out into the haze. In every crime, Watson, he said, at last, there is a voice. Sometimes it shouts. More often, it whispers. The trick is knowing where to listen. The events of the next 48 hours passed in a haze quick, cold and weighty with a kind of silence that settles after a bell has been struck. The sound fades, but the echo clings to the air. Scotland Yard arrived promptly, having been summoned in advance by Holmes with a precision that now struck me as both unsettling and inevitable. Mr. Augustus Bramley offered no resistance. In fact, he barely acknowledged the charges read to him by Inspector Lestrade, simply placed the lacquered reliquary now, sealed in a linen sicon, the table, and folded his hands over his belly as if the matter were finally out of his reach. It was never about the money, he said, as the shackles closed about his wrists. It was about the name, our name. Do you understand what it's like to watch your lineage rot from the inside out, while your fortune bleeds into history books and second-rate museums? Holmes, who stood by the hearth with his hands clasped behind his back, regarded him with quiet detachment. I understand vanity, he said. I also understand cowardice. Marsh was less composed, under pressure from the yard and faced with Holmes' damning deductions. He confessed in full. Bramley had orchestrated the entire charade. From the whispered voices produced through thin copper piping rerouted from the estate's disused ventilation shafts to the staged sightings of Lady Agatha in London's opium underworld, Marsh had acted on direct instruction, aided by Bramley's money and veiled threats of exposure regarding his military past. But the final horror was this: Lady Agatha had not died immediately, get drugged, disoriented, and cast into the hidden vault beneath the estate gardens. She had lived for nearly 2 days before succumbing, likely due to exposure, dehydration, and trauma. Marsh had visited once to ensure she had not escaped. She had not even tried. She had stopped speaking, Marsh said, trembling. She just sat there, holding the reliquary in her lap. We returned to Baker Street late that evening, exhausted, in mind and spirit. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with tea and anxious glances, but neither of us spoke much. Holmes disappeared into his bedroom for nearly an hour before emerging again, this time in his dressing gown, his violin resting in one hand. He played for nearly 10 minutes, something low and mournful, unfamiliar to me. When he finished, he remained motionless for some time, the bow still hovering above the strings. I cannot always take pride in the result, he said at last, even if the deduction was sound. It was a vile act, I said, staring into my untouched cup. Cleverly hidden, yes, but vile all the same. Holmes nodded once. I suppose what disturbs me most, I continued, is how close it all came to working. How perfectly she was silenced, her fears dismissed, her mind questioned, and in the end, buried like a secret sin, all by those who stood to benefit. Holmes looked at me. That is the real horror of the matter, he said. It is not the method that fascinates me, Watson. It is the trust that makes the method possible. He rose then, pacing slowly across the rug. Bramley didn't need to create a perfect lie, only a plausible one. He leveraged the vulnerability of a woman already seen as delicate. Kay didn't murder her in rage or haste. Kay eroded her reality until the truth itself collapsed. He paused, turning to the window where the night fog coiled around the lamps beyond. This was not a locked room mystery. It was an open room where the walls were built in her mind. The morning papers, of course, handled the affair with their usual lack of grace. The king, the lady, and the moonstone, a crime among the gentry, screamed one headline. A portrait, the footman, and the secret burial offered another. Some claimed Lady Agatha had gone mad long before the plot began. Others called her a guardian of history, a tragic figure caught in the snare of aristocratic greed. Holmes read them all with a mixture of boredom and disdain. Truth, he muttered, tossing the last one aside, is rarely as fashionable as theory. That afternoon, Inspector Lestrade stopped by with a personal note from the Home Office, thanking Holmes for his invaluable assistance. The Yard, ever reluctant to publicly share credit, had quietly admitted that without Holmes' intervention, the case would have remained at best a cold disappearance and, at worst, a scandal hushed into forgetfulness. Lestrade also brought news that the reliquary had been claimed by the British Museum, pending further analysis. Holmes had no interest in its fate. Let them catalog it, lock it behind glass, and debate its origins endlessly, he said. Its value now lies in what it cost. In the days that followed, I found myself returning often to the small, strange details of the case of ivy that had been too thick, the copper piping in the estate, walls, the weeping box scene in Limehouse. Every clue, every misdirection had seemed so insignificant in the moment. Yet each had pointed, if only we knew how to look. Holmes, of course, had seen the path long before I had. He had noticed the missing section of piping during our first walk through the estate. He had questioned why ivy flourished against a sunless wall. He had suspected the reliquary was never meant to be found, only used as bait. And then there was the portrait. It haunted me, still, that majestic image of Lord Mortlake astride his horse, painted in oil and arrogance, watching over a secret he himself had never known. The hiding place behind it had not just concealed treasure. It had concealed a truth the family wished buried. Perhaps that's the true function of such portraits. I said aloud one evening as Holmes tuned his violin, not to honor legacy, but to guard it, to keep the secrets alive long after the men have died. Holmes glanced up. You may be right, Watson. In some houses, history is less a record and more a lockbox. On our final evening before returning to routine, Holmes poured 2 glasses of port and handed one to me. Tell me, Watson, he said, do you still wonder why Lady Agatha clutched the reliquary even in her final moments? I do. Admitted. Surely she knew it was cursed, at least dangerous. She knew, Holmes said softly. But I believe she clung to it, not for fear, but for defiance. In death, she held the very thing they feared most, the truth. He raised his glass to the ones who see clearly, however late the hour. I matched his toast to the ones who whispered through ivy. Chapter 05. Some days after the Mortlake affair had drawn to its grim conclusion, I found Holmes in the familiar posture he often assumed during periods of reflection, curled like a cat in the armchair by the fire, fingers steepled, his sharp features rendered all the more stark by the flickering glow. He had been particularly quiet that week, save for a few curt discussions with Lestrade and a brief meeting with a reporter from the Times, which Holmes had endured as one suffers a dental extraction, necessary but distasteful. I, for my part, had been unable to shake the image of Lady Agatha, frail and shrouded in black lace, speaking in tremulous tones of ivy that murmured in footsteps that never left tracks. Now that the case had been resolved, its logic traced, its actors exposed, its grim theater dismantled, I found myself dwelling not on the crime itself, but on the man who had solved it. Holmes stirred at last and spoke without opening his eyes. "You've been watching me, Watson, and you've been wondering why this case unsettled me." I started, not from guilt, but from the uncanny precision with which he had plucked the thought from my mind. "Yes," I admitted, "you've encountered murderers before, and secrets. But there's something about this one. It lingers." Holmes opened his eyes, then gray, cool, and alert. "I do not weep for Lady Agatha," he said, "though I mourn the conditions of her undoing. What truly unsettled me is how close the truth came to being overwritten." He leaned forward, resting his chin on one hand. "There was a moment, do you recall, when you yourself questioned her sanity? He did not speak it, but I saw it in your eyes. And had we left then, as Bramley intended, the story would have stood. A nervous widow, a vanishing act, and a footnote in the family's ledger." "I'm ashamed to say you're right," I murmured. "But isn't that what makes your method so indispensable? You listen differently than the rest of us. You see differently." Holmes gave a rare, faint smile. "You romanticize me, Watson, and yet, perhaps, it's better that you do." The days returned to their usual rhythm. London, ever indifferent to the triumphs and tragedies of its citizens, moved on. The headlines shifted to the scandal of a parliamentarian's indiscretion and a runaway lion from the London Zoo. Only one or two periodicals gave the Mortlake case lasting mention. Still, Holmes' name was spoken in whispers at clubs, across universities, and in drawing rooms from Chelsea to Kensington. His legend, though, he detested the term, grew like ivy itself, stubborn, silent, and insistent. Not for his fame, but for his method, that singular gift, a dissection, of peeling away the layers of narrative until only the bare truth remained. One afternoon, I found him rearranging the contents of his index, a collection of cases, chemical notes, monographs, criminal profiles, and obscure references. On a whim, I asked him whether he had ever considered writing a memoir of his own, a record from your perspective. "Holmes," I said, "you could correct the errors, explain the subtleties I surely miss, set the facts straight." He looked up, bemused. "The facts, my dear Watson, are less valuable than the interpretation, even when the interpretation is flawed, especially then." I must have looked puzzled, for he set his index aside and stood. "Consider this," he said, pacing. "Every case we've shared, every thread of deduction has depended not only on what was there, but what was missing. The cigar ash left in the wrong room, but the footprint that shouldn't have existed. The silence where there should have been noise. Truth in my work is not shouted. It is whispered, obscured, mocked." He paused. "And yet, someone always sees it. Someone questions. Someone looks twice." I nodded slowly. "You mean people like Lady Agatha?" "Precisely." Later that evening, as we sat before the fire, I asked him why he thought certain cases like Mortlake stayed with us more than others. "Is it the elegance of the solution, I asked, "the cruelty of the crime, or the victim?" Holmes was silent for a long time. Then he said, "None of those. What lingers is proximity. The closer evil stands to the ordinary, the more it chills the blood. A maniac with a knife in Whitechapel is tragic, yes, but expected. A cousin who offers tea while plotting burial, that is the true horror." I thought of Bramley's rehearsed calm, his velvet dressing gown, the polite, cultivated voice that had concealed a festering rot. Holmes continued, "When the monstrous hides behind a well-tied cravat, the world stares and calls it civility. Only those willing to tear the cravat discover the stain beneath. What do you do?" I said softly. He gave a dry chuckle. That is what I must do. I have often wondered, since then, whether Holmes sees the world in a light forever foreign to the rest of us. Where I perceive nuance, he perceives contradiction. Where I see character, he sees motive. And where I rest in the comfort of logic, he pursues the discomfort of truth. And yet, despite the gulf between us, I have always known this. He cares, not in the sentimental sense, perhaps, but in the intellectual one. Holmes values clarity, integrity, justice stripped of emotion, but not devoid of purpose. It is why he solves what others abandon, why he asks questions no one dares, and why, even now, long after the lamps of Baker Street have gone dark and the violin's final note has faded, I find myself writing of him still. Some weeks after Mortlake, as spring began to peer nervously through the London mist, Holmes and I walked through Regent's Park. It was a rare day of sun, and Holmes was in an unusually introspective mood. "Watson," he said, "do you ever think of how we shall be remembered?" "I try not to," I said truthfully. "That's your business. Mine is surviving your escapades." He smiled. "And yet, in time, stories blur, dates fall away. The case, this is most of them, will be forgotten, but something will remain." "What do you think it will be?" Holmes gazed out at the still pond, the light playing on the surface like glass. "A man once said that truth is not louder than a light is only steadier. It does not scream to be heard. It waits. I hope, if anything, that they remember I waited, that I listened, that I looked. And that, dear reader, is why Sherlock Holmes remains the timeless detective we cannot forget, not because he always won, but because he always saw, because long after the case is closed, the whisper through the ivy is still their end. He is the one turns his head to listen. The months following the Mortlake case were curiously quiet. No telegrams bearing strange ciphers, no baronets with trembling hands at our doorstep, no footprints in the snow or bloodstains on the floor. Holmes passed his days in idle routine, immersed in Chemistry 1. Day, violin concertos. The next, with the occasional outburst of frustration directed at the tedium of ordinary life. "I believe I am cursed with perception," T told me once while dashing ink across a monograph titled "On the Behavioral Markers of Concealed Malice." Once the eye is trained to spot deception, it finds little joy in simplicity. I, however, welcomed the reprieve. My practice had regained its momentum, and I had begun drafting my notes on the Mortlake affair for possible publication, though. I intended to wait until Lady Agatha's name could be cleared publicly, and Romilly's trial had run its course. One fog-cloaked evening, as I sat trimming the last paragraphs of my draft, Holmes appeared in the doorway, a newspaper folded under his arm and a strange look on his face, neither surprise nor concern, but something more pensive. "Watson," he said, "do you recall Lady Agatha's final letter to her solicitor?" "Of course, you referenced it in your deductions. The one about a voice from the gallery and the eye that weeps in ivory." "What of it?" He handed me the paper. I scanned it quickly. "Then read it again. Mystery at Vauxhall. Antiquities dealer found dead amid ransacked shop authorities. Suspect ritual theft." Ty looked up. "This was the dealer you wrote to. The one you suspected might know about the reliquary." Holmes nodded. His name was Edmund Halifax. He had received word from Lady Agatha 6 days before her disappearance. She intended to deliver the Moonstone reliquary into his custody, pending confirmation of its origin and potential ties to stolen colonial artifacts. But I never told anyone the name of the recipient, not even the Yard. And yet, someone clearly sought him out. The implication struck me at once. "You think the reliquary was only the surface of something larger?" "Precisely," Holmes said, pacing. "We believed the crime ended at Mortlake, that Bramley acted alone. motivated by inheritance and familial pride. But what if someone else nudged him forward? Someone who benefited from the reliquary staying buried. I thought of March's confession, of the quiet nods, the hints of pressure Bramley never fully explained. You think Bramley was manipulated? I said. Or coerced? Or guided? Holmes murmured, much like a bishop in a chess game. Not the king, not the hand, but a piece moved by another. He stared at the fireplace, watching embers curl inward. There are layers still sealed, Watson. Secrets that the Mortlake affair only brushed against. Over the following days, Holmes became absorbed once more, though this time in silence rather than brilliance. He spent hours in old records, poring over shipping ledgers from Calcutta, colonial dispatches from 1857, and references to relics lost in the siege of Lucknow. He muttered names in the middle of meals. Sir Edwin Coleridge, Anne's Row, Alastair Vance. None familiar at all, I suspected, linked to some thread only he could see. One morning, I found him examining a photograph of the reliquary taken by Scotland Yard before it was secured for the museum. You see the inlay? He asked, pointing with the tip of a matchstick. I looked. It was the eye-shaped moonstone in the center. What am I meant to see? There's a nick on the iris, barely visible, but it's not a flaw in the stone. It's an etching, a cipher, old Persian script, likely added decades after its creation. What does it say? Holmes turned the photograph in the light. Keep me, and the shadow follows. I stared at him. He smiled faintly. That, Watson, is not the language of a decorative heirloom. It's the language of warning. That evening, Holmes took no dinner. He sat in near total darkness, violin in hand, though he never played. Lit the gas lamp and gently prodded him from his trance. You believe the Mortlake reliquary was not just valuable but dangerous? Yes, he said, voice low. Not in a supernatural sense, but dangerous to those who possess it. Key, perhaps, or a ledger. A signal. For what? I don't know. But I feared the Mortlake affair wasn't a conclusion. It was a preface. I leaned forward. And what will you do? Holmes stood, drawing his coat from the rack. Follow the shadow, he said, before it forgets to look back. In the days that followed, Holmes vanished from Baker Street. He left behind only a short note, written in his precise, upright hand. Watson, do not worry. There is work to be done, but it lies beyond the boundaries of our ordinary streets. If I do not return by Michaelmas, presume I have succeeded or vanished into a deeper puzzle. Yours, as ever, S.H. I read it 3 times before placing it in my journal, and so I waited. Autumn arrived, and the fog thickened. No word came, but I know Holmes, and I know that somewhere, whether in the caverns of an ancient museum or the recesses of a foreign archive, he is still unraveling the thread that began in a dusty gallery, beneath the gaze of a painted ancestor, and behind the ivy of Mortlake Hall. I write this final page, not to end the tale, but to leave it open, as Holmes himself would prefer. For even in silence, his presence lingers, in the echo of his footfalls across Baker Street, in the restless flick of violin strings, in the endless questioning of the world's assumed answers. Sherlock Holmes is not bound to time. He is not confined to casebooks or ink. He is a whisper. He is the one who looks again when all others have turned away. Chapter 06. When the first letter arrived, I had just concluded my morning rounds. It was a Wednesday in late October, cold enough to make the glass tremble and gray enough to drain the cheer from even the hardiest Londoner. The note was folded into a nondescript envelope with no return address. Sealed with a black wax emblem, I did not recognize an eye-shaped crest with an inverted crown. Holmes' handwriting was unmistakable. Watson, the shadow I mentioned, is real. I have crossed a boundary, not of law, but of allegiance. You must not follow. Huh? But you must understand, the reliquary was never just a container. It is a page torn from a book no one remembers writing. Set, that was all. No destination, no date, no hint of return. I read it again by firelight that night and felt an unease I could not shake. Holmes had vanished before, but always with purpose, always with traceable clues. This time, it felt different. It felt cloaked. Mrs. Hudson, kind soul that she is, did her best to distract me. She insisted on airing Holmes' study, rearranging his chemical instruments, and placing fresh flowers beside the window, as if he might reappear with the same suddenness with which he'd departed. But days turned into weeks. No more letters came, until one did. The second message arrived, not by post, but in the breast pocket of a dead man. His name was Elias Penberry, an antiquities broker in Shoreditch, known for dealings in questionable relics. He had been found in a canal, face down, his pockets emptied save for a sealed envelope containing a single sheet of cream parchment bearing Holmes' precise script. Watson, if this reaches you, know that I am close. The reliquary led me to an archive beneath Naples, hidden among the wreckage of the Bourbon vaults. Inside, names, dates, maps, a trade not of gemstones, but of favors traded like currency among monarchs, priests, and merchants. There is a ledger, and the moonstone was one page of it. Trust no one wearing a red carnation. SH _. This was no ordinary correspondence. This was a cipher within a warning, passed from the living to the dead, and somehow rooted back to me. And yet, Holmes' voice remained firm. It veiled. I took the message directly to Mycroft Holmes. He read it with the restraint of a man accustomed to unpleasant truths, then folded it once and tucked it into his vest pocket. You understand? He said coolly, that if Sherlock is correct, then we are no longer dealing with isolated crimes, but with the mechanisms that hide them. You knew about the ledger, I said. Mycroft stared out the Diogenes Club window for a long time. Know of many ledgers, he said finally, but I feared this one was legend. The following week, I traveled to Naples. It was not a decision made lightly. I arranged for my practice to be managed in my absence and carried only what I needed. Holmes, 2 letters, K, a map, and a revolver I hoped not to use. Naples was a place of fractured beauty sunlight and ruin in equal measure. But beneath it, Holmes had hinted, lay something older, something hidden. I followed his trail through whisper and coin-paying dockhands, habits, and archivists for fragments of direction. A code here, a sealed door there. Finally, in a crumbling quarter near the coast, I found it. The Bourbon Vault. It was a narrow passage tucked beneath a derelict monastery, sealed behind a rusted iron grate that took half a day to pry open. What lay beyond was a descent into stone, damp air, and the kind of silence that feels older than God in the deepest chamber. Surrounded by rotting parchment and the musty perfume of forgotten ages, I found it, a book, bound in serpent leather, locked with a clasp of obsidian. I did not open it. I could not, but carved into its spine was the same crest Holmes had marked in wax the eye and inverted crown, and on a broken table nearby, familiar matchbox, Baker Street blend. He had been there recently. I emerged into daylight, blinking and shaken, the notebook clutched tightly in a leather wrap. I made my way to the British consulate and arranged passage back to England. But even then, I knew I was no longer returning to the life I had known. Something had shifted. Holmes had always drawn mystery to himself, like iron to magnet. But this was no longer just a case. This was a current, a quiet tide pulling him into a deeper sea dot. 2 months passed. Then, just after the new year, I received a final letter. No envelope, no postage, just a folded page resting on my breakfast tray in Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson swore she hadn't placed it. Watson, the ledger breathes. It contains promises written in the blood of nations. Hey, and there are those who would kill to keep it unread. I remain at large. You remain my conscience. Guard what I cannot, till it is time. SH underscore. I folded the page and placed it beside the reliquary photograph on my mantle. The world had changed, though few would see it. A detective had gone missing, but his methods endured. His voice endured. In the quiet corners of London. The rustle of files no longer closed, and in the anxious glances of men wearing red carnations, I knew Sherlock Holmes was still at work. I departed Vienna with more than Sour's list I carried unease, heavy and unfamiliar, like a fever one can't sweat out. I had always been the chronicler, the observer, the man who followed Holmes into the shadows but never stayed in them. Now I was being asked to proceed alone, and it felt, in a way, like standing in for a man who could no longer die because his work had not finished. Sour's list contained 5 names, each one handwritten in a mix of Latin script and code. Each line bore a location, an item, and a word Holmes had underlined himself. Professor Halden Lucerne, Switzerland, aviary teeth, Madame Bellamy Marseille, France violin case, empty, Arslan, Javid, Calcutta, ledger of flames, Hortense, Petrovich, Warsaw, ivory nail. 3. Fletcher, Brian, Brighton, England, echoes of room 7. It was the last that struck me with sudden clarity. Brighton, England, close to home, and a man whose name I remembered only vaguely from Holmes' mutterings during quieter times. Brian had once worked with the Admiralty as a naval cryptographer, brilliant, reclusive, fond of French absinthe and opera, and rumored to have vanished into opium after being discharged without honors. Holmes had once remarked, "Tia, there are men who disappear behind doors they built for themselves." Brian constructed 100. It was enough. I booked passage to Brighton. I arrived under a smothering sky, salt thick wind curling through the cracks of the train carriage as if to warn me off. Brighton had changed since my last visit last seaside. Gaiety, more rust along the railings. The pavilion stood gaudy as ever, but the color had faded. Brian, I discovered, had taken up residence at a boarding house on the East Cliff, registered under the name Frances Gibbon. The landlady, Mrs. Dale, was an inquisitive widow who described him as a strange gentleman always scribbling, talking to himself, and humming snatches of Mozart. Polite, but peculiar. Yes, she added, he wears gloves, even in summer. Gray ones. My stomach turned. And does he ever, I hesitated, carry an umbrella? Her face twitched just slightly. He keeps one near the front door, red-handled, though I can't say I've seen him use it. That night, I did not sleep. I sat awake, revolver on the desk, Sour's list beside it, trying to piece together the silent puzzle Holmes had left me. By morning, I resolved to confront Brian. Room 7. The door was locked. I knocked, no answer. I knocked again, louder. Still nothing. I glanced back down the hall. Sten produced the slender tool Holmes had left me years ago, his emergency pick, disguised as a pen nib. The lock was old. It yielded with an unsettling ease. The room smelled of ink, pipe tobacco, and citrus. Brian sat at the desk, unmoving. At first, I thought him asleep. Then I saw the glazed stare, the hands folded too neatly, the fingers that had stiffened into unnatural curvature. Taut, dead. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no poison vials, just a paper weighted down by a cracked METRONOME dot at the top. Written in a spidery, cramped script were 4 words. I heard the echo. Below that, an image inked with incredible precision of the same reliquary Holmes had once held. But this time, the eye on its surface was open, and beneath it, Another phrase, printed in Greek. Lethe whispers backwards. Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. Backwards. I scanned the room. The wardrobe was ajar. Inside, no clothes, only stacks of paper. Each page listing dates, initials, and phrases like mouth resealed, ash spoken, hand curator, absent 5. One sheet bore a circle, drawn in pencil. Edit center, 5 petals each, labeled with the city, Marseille, Warsaw, Lucerne, Brighton, Calcutta. The 5th ledger. Before I could process more, I heard a floorboard creak behind me. I turned, sharply, gun raised, but it was Mrs. Dale. She recoiled, with a startled cry, eyes wide at the revolver. I heard the door, she stammered. I didn't know. Brian is dead, I said, quietly. Call the police, but say nothing of this list or the flower. Holmes. Her gaze flicked to the paper on the desk, and then quickly away. I understand, she whispered. I wasn't sure she did. Back in London, I returned to Baker Street with a page from Brian's desk tucked deep in my coat. I had it translated by a scholar at King's College. Lethe whispers backwards, he confirmed. But that's not all. It's a reference to anti-memory paradox, remembering what you were supposed to forget. It echoed Holmes' words. I set about rereading my notes. There was meaning in the pattern. Lucerne of eerie teeth, or ivory nail. Each object, a cipher. Each city, a door. Dot. Each death, a seal. And Holmes, somewhere within it all, still alive, or at least still moving. The world around me had not changed. The fog still clung to the gas lamps. The newsboys still called headlines in clipped Cockney. But I had changed. I was no longer merely a chronicler. I was the last barrier between the truth Holmes unearthed and the men who wanted it reburied. A 5th ledger exists, and someone is willing to kill everyone connected to it, Holmes once said. Some truths do not bring light, but cast longer shadows. I had stepped into one, and I did not know how far it stretched. Chapter 7. I arrived in Calcutta under a moon the color of old brass, the heat rising like steam from cobbled streets and red-washed brick. It was February, yet the air clung with the weight of late summer, thick, breathless, and alive with sound. Even at night, the city murmured rickshaw bells, distant prayers. The rustle of markets still half awake, but I had no time for beauty. I had come for a man named Arslan Javed, the 3rd name on Sauer's list, and, according to Holmes' ciphered notes, the keeper or seeker of something called the Ledger of Flames. The phrase had puzzled me for days. It had the ring of poetry. Yes, but Holmes did not indulge in metaphors unless they hid truths. If there was a fire to this ledger, it was metaphorical information so dangerous it could ignite ruin in the hands of the wrong men. And I suspected those men were already looking for it. The British consulate directed me to the College of Eastern Histories, a quiet sandstone edifice tucked between a crumbling fort wall and the Hooghly River. There, found Jabbat not in his office, but in the archives below, where he spent his evenings indexing Persian scrolls and lost census records in 3 languages. He was older than I'd expected, mid-60s, with silvered hair tied back in a knot and skin like worn parchment. His eyes were sharp, however, and when I introduced myself, not as Watson, but as a friend of Mr. Holmes, his expression changed at once. Holmes, he whispered, voice thick with accent. I feared he was gone. He is, I said, or Neely, but he left a trail, and your name was on it. Hey, gestured for silence, and led me into a small room behind a row of locked cabinets. A rusted fan stirred the humid air as Joft drew a cloth from a long wooden box. Inside, a charred volume barely intact, the leather bubbling from age and flame. The Ledger of Flames, he said. Or what remains of it. I leaned closer. Faded ink traced lines across the brittle parchment names, dates, ship manifests. But it wasn't until he turned to the third page that my heart stalled. Mortlake, 1887. Codename, eyewitness, recipient, R. Bramley. Object, Moonstone Reliquary. Status, transferred. There it was, a direct reference to the artifact, and beneath it, a symbol etched in what looked like oil-painted inverted crown. My blood ran cold. What does this mean? I asked. Javek looked tired. It means Mortlake was no accident. It was part of a cycle. Every 20 years, a different city, a different item, different man tasked with protecting or destroying the evidence. I studied the ledger. How? Many volumes exist. 5, we think, he said. It's each entrusted to a keeper. Each listing names of agents, informants, and archives not meant to survive Empire and the others. Lost, burned, or, worse, claimed. He snapped the ledger shut. You must leave Calcutta tonight. I argued. Of course, I wasn't about to abandon the trail after coming halfway around the world. But Javd was insistent. You don't understand what this is, he said. You think it's about history, about artifacts. It's not. It's about erasure. Entire wars rewritten, revolts blamed on the wrong men. Truth bent until it fits the shape of empire. He glanced toward the cracked window. They found me last week. 2 men, British accents, offered money for the ledger. When I refused, they returned with silence. My apprentice vanished. My rooms were searched. I am not safe. Then come with me, I said. You can hide in England. Javed smiled grimly. No, doctor. My bones belong to this soil. Yours do not. Take this. He handed me a small envelope sealed in black wax, and go to the British Museum. There is a curator there named Fiona Wexley. Sure this. She will know what to do. By dusk, I had secured a berth on a merchant vessel returning to Portsmouth. The air was heavy, thunder murmuring over the horizon, as if nature itself objected. I boarded under a false name. Jonathan Cland kept the envelope hidden beneath the lining of my coat. That night, a storm broke. Thunder shook the vessel. Rain lashed against the iron hull. And in the dark, I dreamed of Holmes standing in a cavern of fire, his coat glowing like ash, the ledger in one hand and a flower in the other. When I awoke, a pillow was damp not with seawater, but sweat. We arrived in England 3 weeks later. By then, I had read Javed's letter 12 times. It was addressed not to Wexley, but to Holmes, written in code, and concluded with a single line. If the 5th ledger breathes, the 4th is buried beneath the lion's eye. Another riddle, another city, another thread. But I knew where I was. Headed next, back in London. I traveled to the British Museum and found Fiona Wexley Ann, archaeologist of South Asian antiquities, with a gaze sharper than most soldiers and a patience that made Holmes look impulsive. When I handed her the letter, she said nothing at first. Then she folded it and asked only one question. Do you trust him, Holmes? I said, with my life. Then follow me. She led me through galleries of stone Buddhas and crumbling maps, queued past the public exhibits and into a lower archive reserved for unregistered relics. There, she opened a drawer labeled in Sanskrit. Inside, a single brass figurine of a lioness I made not of gemstone, but carved ivory. She turned it upside down. A small panel popped free. Inside was a folded scrap of paper. Wexley handed it to me with trembling fingers. Room 43, second shelf, left of the sarcophagus. Pool book 4. Watch the wall. I stared at her. She stared back. The game, she whispered, is still on. The air was heavy in the secret chamber beneath the British Museum. A subterranean vault removed from the clatter of London's gaslit streets above. The narrow corridor smelled of ancient parchment and aruna scent that carried the weight of centuries and secrets no man wished to see exposed. With Fiona Wexley at my side, we approached the numbered shelf she had indicated. I could feel the pulse of the mystery, as if the very walls waited in anticipation. "Here," she whispered, removing a thick, unmarked tome bound in serpent skin, the spine embossed with the familiar inverted crown encircling an eye. I traced my finger over the emblem, its presence both eerie and comforting. As Wexley pulled the book free, a faint mechanical creak echoed behind us. The bookcase itself began to slide aside, revealing a hidden passage beyond a cold, narrow corridor that descended further into the earth. "This," Fiona said, her voice barely audible, "is the true archive. The heart of the Legend Network Holmes sought." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and hope. The pursuit that had taken me from the smoke-filled streets of London to the distant bazaars of Calcutta, from the misty cliffs of Brighton to the sun-drenched alleys of Vienna, was finally reaching its fulcrum. We stepped into the passage, the door sliding shut behind us, plunging us into near darkness. A single lantern hung from the ceiling, its weak light casting long shadows across the stone walls. Ahead lay rows upon rows of iron cabinets, each marked with cryptic symbols and coded numbers, centuries of concealed truths, bound by iron and silence. But at the end of the hall stood a pedestal, and atop it rested the moonstone reliquary, a tie gleaming faintly in the dim light. I moved closer, the object pulsing with a strange energy as if it were alive and aware. Suddenly, footsteps echoed behind us. My hand went instinctively to my revolver, but before I could draw, a figure stepped from the shadow stall, lean, cloaked in a long coat, face obscured beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A second figure emerged, his gloves gray as ash, clutching a red-handled umbrella, the symbol that Holmes had warned me to distrust. The room grew tense. I saw Fiona tense beside me, her eyes narrowing. "Holmes," I breathed, disbelief tightening my throat. From the darkness came a familiar voice, calm, assured, laced with that signature dry wit. "Gentlemen." Sherlock Holmes stepped forward, his sharp gaze pinning the intruders with quiet command. "Your days of playing in the shadows are over." The two men exchanged glances, then slowly lowered their weapons. The first removed his gloves, revealing a hand scarred and trembling. The other folded the umbrella and stepped back. Holmes approached the pedestal, lifting the moonstone reliquary with reverence. "This," he said, voice low and steady, "is not merely an artifact. It is a testament to vigilance, the legacy of those who chose truth over convenience, memory over oblivion." Turning to me, Holmes smiled, rare warmth shining through the usual stoicism. "Watson, you have done well. Your courage and loyalty have preserved more than ledgers and relics. You have safeguarded a promise." The two men retreated silently into the shadows, vanishing as if swallowed by the darkness itself. I exhaled, the weight of weeks, months, years pressing upon me, lifting as though a great burden had been set down. Holmes replaced the reliquary carefully. "Truth," he said quietly, "is a shadow always chased but never fully caught. Yet we must pursue it nonetheless." I felt the familiar swell of admiration and a subtle ache of worry. Holmes had always walked a path alone, but now I knew his battles were fought on a far grander stage than even I had imagined. As dawn's first light filtered through the museum's stained glass, casting fractured rainbows on the stone floor, I realized that this case was not an end, but a beginning. Holmes looked at me, his eyes gleaming with quiet resolve. "There will always be shadows, Watson, and so long as there are, the game endures." I nodded, feeling once more the inexorable pull of the chase. For as long as there is darkness, Sherlock Holmes will be its eternal light, eternal light.